Hello, my name is Lisa Kutas, and I'm happy to be here to share my personal story of how this little book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, forever changed the way I attend Mass and receive Jesus in the Holy Eucharist. Let me give you a little bit of my background. I grew up as a cradle Catholic in a household where being Catholic is what we did for an hour on Sundays. Sure, we prayed before meals and at bedtime when I was a little kid, but actually living out our faith or discussing it as a family didn't happen. Like most young people, once I got to college, I gradually went to church less and less. And eventually, except at family gatherings, I stopped going to church altogether and lived a pretty secular life. Without getting into the details, I managed to make a pretty big mess of my life, and it was within the mess that I realized that I needed God. Over time, He gradually put people in my life that brought me back to my faith and my heart to a deep conversion. Once my conversion started, my hunger to know more and more about Jesus couldn't be satiated, which led me to this book. I don't recall how I heard about it, but I'm sure it was through some other Catholic resource I was reading or a podcast I was listening to. But I was intrigued by the concept of the Jewish roots. Sure, I knew Jesus was Jewish and that our Catholic faith comes from Judaism, but that's about as far as my understanding went. I don't know about you, but I've always been jealous of the two disciples who were joined by Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Even though they didn't recognize him, Jesus, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, interpreted to them in the scriptures the things concerning himself. I used to think in my mind, why can't Jesus do that for me? Why have I spent my whole life trying to understand Jesus, and I feel like it's taking forever? On this short walk, he opened the scriptures for these two disciples so that they could see him as the fulfillment of all that the prophets said. Why couldn't I experience that? Well, this book does exactly that. Just like those two disciples, if you read this book, your heart will be burning within you as the Old Testament scriptures are opened for you to reveal how Jesus appears to us in the Holy Eucharist. If you haven't read this book, I strongly urge you to pick it up and read it or listen to it. Dr. Brant Petrie, unlike some Catholic authors, is incredibly easy to read. He's brilliant, but he clearly explains the theological concepts with such contagious enthusiasm that you cannot wait to tell your friends what you now understand. I read this book once, then I told 5 of my girlfriends from church about it, and we read it together in a Bible study. Dr. Petrie uses reputable resources besides the Bible that give even more depth and color commentary to the Bible stories that may have become a little too familiar to us. I'll highlight 3 insights that forever changed my understanding of the Eucharist. The first is the way Dr. Petrie explained how horrifying it would have been for Jews to be told that they should eat the flesh and drink the blood of a person. Besides being revolting, this concept violated the spirit and the letter of the law going back to Moses. Why on earth would Jesus, a pious Jew, ever suggest such a thing? Jews believed that the spirit of life of the creature was contained in the blood, and therefore they were never to drink the blood of dead animals. So it's quite a leap for the disciples who were law-abiding Jews to jump from the prohibition of drinking blood to embracing the necessity of eating the flesh and drinking the blood of Christ. As you read this book and journey together on this retreat, you will gradually come to understand that the ancient law forbidding the consumption of blood is exactly the reason Jesus tells us that we must eat his flesh and drink his blood, or else we have no life within us. When we participate in the Holy Eucharist, we ingest the life and spirit of the resurrected Jesus, him fully alive, the Son of God, God incarnate. Mind blown! This book, more than anything else, helped me to see the New Testament scriptures through a Jewish lens. I came to understand the context in which the first century Christians would have been living and how they would have interpreted all that Jesus said and did. While I love the whole book, another section that changed the way I pray the Our Father is the section on Jesus as the new manna. In the Our Father, Jesus teaches us to pray, to ask our Father to give us this day our daily bread. I always thought this was a petition to God to provide for our sustenance each day. Don't let me go hungry today. But Dr. Petrie reveals the much deeper meaning behind this petition, getting into the difficulties of accurate modern translation from ancient languages. As it turns out, the petition is asking God to give us each day supernatural bread from heaven. Or, as St. Jerome translated it in the 4th century, give us this day our supersubstantial bread. It is supernatural to be sure, but it is also made up of a substance that is above all other substances. It is God's own soul. A Jew at that time, upon hearing this petition in the Lord's Prayer, would have recalled the manna in the desert, which in fact was a supernatural substance from heaven. This is a much richer understanding of the 4th petition of the Our Father than simply providing us with our basic needs. We beg God to give us Jesus in the Eucharist each day, which is only possible through the consecration of the bread by an ordained priest. We need our priest to fulfill the promise of Jesus that he will be the bread from heaven that gives life to the world. Reflecting on this has given me a renewed appreciation for our priests, and I understand the Eucharist more fully as supersubstantial bread from heaven that I need to receive as often as possible, daily if I'm able. The third insight I've taken away from this book comes from a Jewish tradition called the bread of the presence. I had never heard of this until I read about it. This is one of the 3 sacred objects that was always to be kept in the tabernacle, or the Holy of Holies, along with the Ark of the Covenant and the menorah. I knew about the Ark of the Covenant. I knew it was to be there. I've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. But I had never heard about this bread of the presence, which was to be kept on a golden table. Dr. Petrie again sorts through the ancient languages and the modern translations and arrives at the fullest translation as the bread of the face, or the bread of the face of God. This bread was to be a perpetual offering, continually present before God in the tabernacle. And as long as the bread was present, the menorah must be lit, indicating God's presence. The bread was also accompanied by wine, and incense was burned as part of this ritual offering. The bread and wine were also considered to be an unbloody sacrifice. It was a gift from God to the priests in the form of a meal, but it was also a sacrifice of worship by the priest to God. This sacrificial offering was done on the Sabbath as a most holy sacrifice according to Leviticus. This Sabbath sacrifice and meal for the priests took place every week up until 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. The Jewish people not only had animal sacrifices as part of their worship, but they also had a weekly, unbloody sacrifice, which was also a meal of bread and wine. Sound familiar? I had no idea. And this bread and wine sacrifice was a sacrifice of thanksgiving, a Eucharistic sacrifice. So going back to the road to Emmaus, Jesus appeared to the disciples, but the Bible tells us that their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Jesus was veiled to them. Once he resurrected, Jesus could appear to them in a way that was unfamiliar, so as not to overwhelm them. They were able to walk with him and share all that had happened and their disappointment that Jesus was not the Messiah that they had hoped he was. They shared their lack of faith with him. Jesus responds by walking with them and explaining the scriptures to them in a way that revealed the purpose behind his life, death, and resurrection. But it was only when they sat at table and Jesus broke the bread with them that their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Jesus does this for each of us. He walks with us in our times of doubt, confusion, and suffering. His word, as well as his body and blood, are available to us every day at Mass to comfort and strengthen us. We only need to open our eyes and hearts to him. Take time on this retreat to spend time with Jesus, veiled in the Holy Eucharist. Read this book, read your Bible. I pray that you too will come away from this retreat feeling like you've just walked with Jesus on the road to Emmaus. God bless you all.